June 6, 1944, 6:31 a.m. Omaha Beach, Normandy. A Sherman tank crests a hedgerow. For exactly 2 seconds, its belly armor is exposed. A German soldier with a Panzerfaust fires. The tank erupts in a fireball so violent, it hurls the turret 40 feet into the air. 5 men. Gone. Not in battle. Not charging a machine gun nest. Gone because they tried to climb over a bush. That same scene repeated itself 847 times in the first 3 weeks after D-Day. 847 tanks destroyed. Thousands of men burned alive or torn apart. Not by Tiger tanks. Not by artillery barrages. By hedgerows. Ancient walls of dirt and roots that French farmers had built to mark property lines. The greatest military force in human history was being stopped by glorified garden hedges. And every general, every engineer, every expert with a college degree and brass on their collar had looked at this problem and come up empty. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community. Every subscriber helps us bring these forgotten stories back to life. Then came Curtis Cullin, a mechanic from New Jersey, no degree, no rank worth mentioning. Just a man who fixed cars for a living and refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. What he built in 48 hours using literal trash from the beach would be ordered into mass production by Eisenhower himself. 5,000 units. Deployed across the entire Allied armored force. Historians would later say it shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks. Weeks that translated into tens of thousands of lives. But on June 12, 1944, nobody knew his name. Nobody cared. And the idea burning in his head, his commanding officer called it insane. This is where the story begins. 6 days after D-Day, the Allied advance had stopped completely. Not slowed, stopped. The original plan called for Allied forces to be 30 miles inland by now, pushing hard toward Paris, exploiting the chaos of the beach landings before German reserves could consolidate. Instead, they were measuring progress in yards, sometimes in feet. The bocage country of Normandy, that dense patchwork of ancient fields separated by towering hedgerows, had turned the most sophisticated military operation in human history into a grinding, bloody stalemate. These were not decorative hedges. People who hear hedgerow problem sometimes imagine soldiers frustrated by overgrown shrubbery. The reality was something else entirely. Norman bocage hedgerows were centuries old, built by farmers stacking earth and stone and planting tree roots along the top until they formed walls up to 15 feet high and just as thick. The root systems descended 10 feet or more into the ground. They were functionally natural fortresses, and they covered the Norman countryside like a labyrinth, dividing every field into its own separate killing ground. For infantry, the hedgerows were brutal. Every field crossing meant exposing yourself to enemy fire from men dug in behind the next wall. You cleared one field, you bled for it, you lost men doing it, and then you looked up and saw the next hedgerow 20 yards away, with more Germans behind it. And the field after that. And the one after that, stretching all the way to Germany. For armor, the hedgerows were a death sentence, handed out on a schedule. The standard tactic was the only tactic anyone had figured out: drive the Sherman tank at the hedgerow and attempt to climb over it. The tank's nose would tilt upward as it crested the wall, exposing the belly armor to whatever waited on the other side. Belly armor on a Sherman was thin, dangerously thin. The designers had prioritized frontal protection because that was where the enemy was supposed to be. The bottom of the tank was never meant to face a threat. The Germans understood this perfectly. They positioned men with Panzerfausts, a handheld anti-tank rocket cheap enough to hand out by the thousands just behind every hedgerow. They didn't need to aim carefully. When a Sherman tilted up and exposed its underside, any shot in that direction was a kill shot. The crew had maybe 2 seconds from the moment they crested the hedgerow to the moment the rocket arrived. 2 seconds to do nothing except burn. Allied planners had not been ignorant of the bocage before the invasion. They had studied aerial photographs. They had consulted French resistance members familiar with the terrain. But the scale of the problem only became clear once men were actually fighting in it. Engineering solutions were proposed and attempted. Modified bulldozer blades were attached to some tanks. Explosive charges were tried to blast gaps in the walls. Artillery was called in to break hedgerows apart. None of it worked consistently. The bulldozer blades were too slow and too loud, announcing the breach point to every German in the area before it was even complete. Explosives required time to set and specialists to deploy luxuries that didn't exist in the middle of a firefight. Artillery could break hedgerows, but also churned the ground into impassable mud and alerted defenders that an attack was coming. Day after day, the casualty reports filled with the same cause of death: tank crew, hedgerow crossing. The medics were overwhelmed. The replacement crews arrived, were briefed on the hedgerow problem, watched a Sherman burn on their first day, and understood with cold clarity that their life expectancy was measured in crossings rather than weeks. Nobody at headquarters had a solution. The problem was being studied. Reports were being written. Committees were forming. Men were dying. But nobody had stopped to ask the mechanics. Curtis Cullin was born in 1915 in Cranford, New Jersey, the second of 4 children in a family that never had much but always made things work. His father ran a small auto repair shop, and Cullin grew up around engines the way other children grew up around books. By the time he was 12, he could identify a failing carburetor by sound alone. By 16, he was doing full engine rebuilds on the weekends. He never went to college. There was no money for it, and honestly, it never occurred to him that he needed to. What college taught in theory, Cullin learned by touching things, breaking them, figuring out why they broke, and fixing them better than before. He had a mechanic's mind, which is a specific kind of intelligence that formal education rarely produces and often fails to recognize. A mechanic's mind sees systems. It sees forces and leverage and the relationship between moving parts. It asks not just what is broken, but why it broke and how the design could be changed so it never breaks that way again. When the war came, Cullin enlisted without hesitation. He ended up assigned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, serving as a tank mechanic, which meant he spent most of his time keeping other men's vehicles alive rather than fighting in one himself. He was good at it, exceptionally good. His commanding officers valued him for his practicality, his ability to improvise repairs in the field, using whatever materials were at hand. He had a gift for looking at a broken machine and finding a solution that nobody had written in any manual. In Normandy, that gift was being wasted on oil changes and track repairs while men died 50 yards away. Cullin watched the hedgerow problem the way a mechanic watches an engine that won't start. Not with despair, with focused attention. Something specific was causing the failure. Something specific could fix it. He just needed to identify the mechanism. He watched tank after tank approach a hedgerow and tilt upward. He watched them stop exposed and die. He watched the infantry try to work around the tanks without armor support and get cut down in the open fields. He watched officers radio for artillery and wait 30 minutes for a strike that left the ground churned and impassable anyway. And then one evening, after watching a Sherman crew pulled burning from their vehicle, Cullin sat down with his notebook and started drawing. The insight when it arrived was almost embarrassingly simple. Every solution that had been attempted was trying to help the tank go over the hedgerow. But the hedgerow's power over the tank came entirely from the fact that climbing it forced the vulnerable belly upward. The belly exposure was not a side effect of the hedgerow problem. It was the hedgerow problem. If you remove the belly exposure, you remove the death sentence, which meant the tank needed to go through the hedgerow, not over it. Through it at ground level, keeping the thick frontal armor facing whatever threat waited on the other side. The question was how. These hedgerows had resisted centuries of weather flooding and the weight of farm equipment. You couldn't push through one with a tank's hull directly because the compacted earth and interlocked root systems were too dense and too deep. The tank would stall against it, tracks spinning, and then become a stationary target, even worse than climbing. But what if the tank didn't have to do the work alone? What if something on the front of the tank could cut into the base of the hedgerow, first digging in and creating the leverage needed to rip through rather than push against? Something strong enough to penetrate the earth and roots angled downward so the cutting force went into the base of the wall rather than the top. Cullin sketched for 2 hours. He drew prongs. Steel prongs, thick and angled slightly downward, mounted on the front hull of a Sherman. The tank would accelerate to full speed and drive the prongs directly into the base of the hedgerow. The prongs would dig in the tank's 30 tons of momentum, would continue forward, and the root system would tear apart from the bottom up rather than resist a push from above. The tank would burst through at ground level. Frontal armor forward the entire time, belly never exposed. The design was crude. It looked, as one soldier would later describe it, like someone had welded tusks onto the front of a tank. But the physics were completely sound. Cullin knew they were sound the way a mechanic knows when a repair is right before testing it. The forces added up. The leverage was there. Something had to give, and it wouldn't be the steel. Now he needed the steel. He went to his commanding officer the next morning with his notebook. Captain Samuel Morrison listened to the proposal with the expression of a man being told the earth was flat. He asked Cullin to repeat it. Cullin repeated it. Morrison was quiet for a long moment that felt to Cullin like it lasted most of the war. Then Morrison said what everyone expected him to say. "You want to take a damaged tank, weld scrap metal to it, and drive it full speed into a solid earthen wall. That is your plan." "Yes, sir," Cullin said. "Because the current plan is driving tanks over hedgerows where they die in 2 seconds. My plan keeps frontal armor facing the enemy the entire time. The Germans need the belly shot. We never give them the belly shot, they can't kill the tank." Morrison stared at him. The logic was undeniable. The approach was still completely insane. Modified tanks in a combat zone built by a mechanic with no engineering credentials using scrap metal, deployed in active fighting, without any doctrine or testing framework behind them. But men were burning every day while committees wrote reports. "How long?" Morrison asked. 48 hours, Cullin said. Morrison told him he had his 48 hours and that they would both be explaining themselves to very angry generals if this failed. It was the most important yes that anyone said during the entire Normandy campaign, though neither man knew it yet. Dundee Cullin moved immediately. He needed steel, and he knew exactly where to find it. The invasion beaches were still covered in German defensive obstacles. Steel anti-tank barriers, called Czech hedgehogs. Massive iron structures made of 3 heavy beams, welded in a star shape, and designed to rip apart the hulls of landing craft. The Germans had planted thousands of them. Allied engineers had been clearing them from the beaches for days, stacking them in piles, unsure what to do with them. They were heavy hard, made of exactly the grade of steel that Cullin needed. He took a crew to the beach with cutting torches and worked through the night. They cut the hedgehog beams into 4-foot sections, sharpened the ends, and loaded them onto a truck. Back at the staging area, they welded them to the front hull of a damaged Sherman that was still mobile. Cullin worked the angles himself, calculating by eye and by feel where the prongs needed to sit to strike the base of a hedgerow correctly. Too high, and the tank would still tilt. Too low, and they'd just plow dirt. The sweet spot was a 15-degree downward angle from the hull mounting point, positioned so impact force drove into the root system rather than deflecting off it. By dawn of the second day, the modification was complete. 4 steel prongs jutted from the tank's front, like the tusks of some mechanical prehistoric animal. Soldiers gathered to look at it. Some laughed. One man said it looked like a pig trying to mate with a porcupine. Cullin patted the steel and said nothing. Morrison arrived, examined every weld, tested the structural connections, and then told Cullin they were going to find a thick hedgerow and see if this was genius or suicide. They found one. 12 feet of ancient compacted earth, and roots the kind of wall that had killed Sherman crews all month. Officers gathered to watch. Cullin stood with them, his hands entirely still, because he had made himself stop checking them. Either the physics worked, or they didn't. He had done everything a mechanic could do. The Sherman's engine built to a roar. 30 tons of steel accelerated across the field. The impact was thunderous. Earth exploded outward. Roots snapped like rifle shots. The tank shuddered, seemed to hesitate for one terrifying second, and then began to move forward. The prongs were working. They were buried in the ancient wall, tearing through root systems that had been growing since before anyone alive was born. The tank tilted slightly forward, nose-down frontal armor facing everything, never once exposing the belly. And then it was through. Clean breach. Wide enough for infantry to follow. The crew popped their hatches and climbed out, grinning. The officers who'd been watching stood in silence for exactly 3 seconds. Then, Major Jack Williams turned to Cullin and asked how many tanks he could modify per day. 10, Cullin said. More if he had enough welders. Williams told him he would have 50 welders by tomorrow and that a report was going to General Bradley within the hour. Cullin had built his device from beach garbage in 2 days. He had solved in 48 hours what experts had failed to solve in 3 weeks. And he had done it with the only tools he'd ever needed: a mechanic's understanding of how forces work, and a captain crazy enough to say yes. But one successful test in a controlled environment was not enough. Cullin knew that. Morrison knew it. The only real proof was combat. Real hedgerows. Real Germans waiting behind them. Real Panzerfausts in real hands pointed at a real tank that Cullin had modified. The combat trial was scheduled for dawn. Cullin would ride inside. He spent that night rechecking every weld, not because he doubted the engineering, because the engineering was all he had any control over now. Tomorrow everything else was up to the physics, and the Germans, and whatever combination of courage and luck kept men alive in a war. In Part 2, the rhinoceros rolls into combat for the first time. The prongs meet a real German defensive position. A Panther tank appears from behind a hedgerow, with its gun already traversing toward them. And what happens in the next 60 seconds will convince General Omar Bradley to order the most rapid battlefield equipment deployment in American military history. 30 tons of steel. 4 crude prongs welded from beach garbage. 1 mechanic with no engineering degree. And a commanding general who'd just read the report and used one specific word to describe the Cullin hedgerow cutter. Promising. Not revolutionary, not brilliant, promising. The same word generals used before they filed reports in drawers and forgot about them. Curtis Cullin had built something that worked. He'd proven it in a controlled test. He'd even gotten a major to send word up the chain. But the chain had many links, and several of those links were held by men who had spent 30 years learning exactly how tanks were supposed to operate. Men who did not appreciate a New Jersey mechanic suggesting they'd been doing it wrong. Dio. In the first 3 weeks after D-Day, Allied forces had advanced an average of 400 yards per day. The original plan projected 4 miles. The gap between those two numbers was filled entirely with dead Americans. And somewhere in a command tent, 12 miles from the front, a brigadier general named Harold Forsyth was preparing to explain to Curtis Cullin exactly why his solution was not a solution at all. The meeting happened on June 15, 1944. Cullin was escorted in, still wearing grease-stained fatigues. Forsyth sat behind a folding table, covered in maps, flanked by 2 colonels who had the expressions of men attending a mandatory meeting they considered beneath them. Forsyth looked at Cullin for a moment before speaking. "Sergeant, I've reviewed Major Williams's report. Your device performed adequately in a single controlled demonstration against an undefended hedgerow. That is a significant distance from combat effectiveness." "Sir, we tested it in a live combat environment against a German strongpoint 3 days ago," Cullin said. "We breached 11 hedgerows. We eliminated a machine gun position, an infantry fortification, and a Panther tank." Forsyth folded his hands. "I'm aware of the after-action report. I'm also aware that your modifications have not been approved through proper engineering channels. You welded unvetted steel of unknown grade and structural integrity onto a combat vehicle. Any failure of those prongs under battle stress could jam a tank's tracks, render the vehicle immobile under fire, and kill the crew you're trying to protect. Cullin kept his voice level. Sir, with respect, the current approved method exposes the belly armor and kills the crew in 2 seconds. My method has produced 0 crew fatalities in 11 combat breaches. Forsyth's expression didn't change. You have your orders, Sergeant. Return to your unit. This matter is under review. Man, under review. While 400 yards per day bled into the dirt, Cullin walked out of that tent knowing that under review meant buried. He had 48 hours before Forsyth's assessment went formal, which would effectively ground every modification he'd already installed and prevent any new ones. He needed someone with more stars than Forsyth, and he needed them today. He found Lieutenant Colonel George Dodd in a vehicle depot outside Bayeux, personally inspecting a column of replacement Shermans just arrived from England. Dodd was unusual among officers of his rank. He'd spent 8 years as a civilian automotive engineer before the war, working on commercial truck design for Ford. He understood machines the way Cullin understood machines, which is to say, he understood them in his hands and not just on paper. Cullin approached him directly and without appointment, which violated approximately 6 layers of military protocol. Dodd could have had him removed. Instead, he listened for 4 minutes without interrupting. Then he walked over to the nearest Sherman crouched down and looked at the front hull mounting points for 30 seconds. You angled the prongs at 15 degrees downward, Dodd said. Not to bulldoze, to create a lever action using the root system as the fulcrum. Yes, sir, Cullin said. The hedgerow tears itself apart from the inside. Dodd stood up. Forsyth's objection about steel grade is not unreasonable. Czech hedgehog beams are manufactured to anti-vehicle obstacle specifications. Do you know the tensile strength? Cullin told him. He'd looked it up. It was within acceptable range for the application. Dodd nodded slowly. Show me the welds on your prototype, Dodd said. They drove to the staging area. Dodd spent 20 minutes examining every joint with a flashlight and a practiced eye. He tapped the prongs with a steel rod, listening to the resonance. He had Cullin walk him through the installation process step by step. Then he straightened up and said, I'm going to request a formal demonstration for General Bradley's staff. You will have one chance. The demonstration must include at minimum 3 hedgerow breaches of varying density, one of which must be a hedgerow rated by our engineers as impassable to standard armor. If the device fails on any of the 3, the program ends. If it succeeds, I will personally recommend immediate mass deployment. Are those terms acceptable? Cullin said they were. Dodd told him he had 72 hours to prepare. He also told him that Forsyth would be in attendance, which meant the demonstration had to be flawless. Not good, not adequate. Flawless. The next 3 days were the most technically demanding of Cullin's life. He pulled his welding crew back together and rebuilt the prototype from scratch, this time documenting every material specification and weld technique in writing, so that Dodd's engineering objection could be answered on paper as well as in steel. They sourced hedgehog beams that had been cleared from the primary landing beaches beams that had been load tested by Army engineers and stamped with material certifications. Every prong was checked for stress fractures under magnification. Every weld was reinforced with secondary passes. Cullin barely slept. He kept running calculations, checking angles, trying to anticipate every failure mode that an audience of skeptical officers might witness. The third hedgerow, the one rated impassable, was the one that kept him awake. His device had never attempted anything like it. If it stalled there in front of Forsyth and Bradley's staff, the program was finished. June 18th, 1944, 700 hours. A field outside the village of St. Lo. 14 officers attended. Forsyth stood on the left. Dodd stood on the right. Between them was Brigadier General Walter Robertson, representing General Bradley's headquarters directly. The weather was overcast, the ground damp visibility adequate. 3 hedgerows had been selected and pre-surveyed. The third stood at the far end of the field, 14 feet high root systems, estimated at 12 feet deep. Army engineers had assessed it the previous day and confirmed their rating: impassable to standard armor without engineering support. The Sherman with Cullin's prongs sat idling at the start line. Cullin was inside in the commander's position. His crew was Mitchell and Harrison, same men who'd ridden the first combat trial. None of them spoke as the signal came. First hedgerow, 8 feet, standard density. The tank accelerated across the wet grass prongs forward, engine pushing hard. Impact. Dirt erupted sideways. Roots snapped. The tank shuddered once maintained forward momentum and burst through in 4 seconds. Clean. No belly exposure. Robertson made a note on his clipboard. Second hedgerow, 11 feet, reinforced with stone foundation at the base which Cullin had not known about in advance. The prongs hit stone instead of earth. For 1 second, the tank stopped completely. Cullin felt his stomach drop. Then the engine torque overcame the resistance, the prongs found the root mass above the stone layer, and the forward motion resumed. The breach took 9 seconds instead of 4. It wasn't clean, but the tank got through. Forsyth said something to the colonel beside him. Cullin couldn't hear it. He didn't need to. Third hedgerow, 14 feet, 12-foot roots. Impassable. Cullin told Mitchell to hit it at 30 degrees off-center rather than straight on. The angled approach would concentrate force on one section of the root system rather than distributing it across the full width of the prongs. Mitchell acknowledged. The Sherman turned slightly and accelerated. The impact was the hardest yet. The entire tank jolted forward against its own inertia. The prongs drove deeper than any previous breach. The engine redlined. For 5 seconds nothing moved. The tank sat embedded in the face of the hedgerow tracks, churning smoke pouring from the exhaust, and every officer watching either wrote something down or stopped breathing. Then the roots gave. Not gradually. All at once, the internal structure of the wall collapsed inward, the way a dam gives when the pressure finally exceeds the material strength. The Sherman exploded through the far side in a cascade of earth and torn vegetation, and landed nose down in the field beyond. 11 seconds total, start to finish. Robertson walked toward the breach before the dust settled, stepping through the gap and examining the walls on either side. The tank had created an opening 7 feet wide at the base, wide enough for infantry columns to move through 2 abreast. He crouched and looked at the root sections that had been torn loose. He stood. He turned back to the assembled officers. General Forsyth Robertson said, "I'll be filing my recommendation to General Bradley this afternoon." He paused. "The recommendation will be for immediate full deployment." Forsyth said nothing. Whatever he thought privately, his professional instincts told him the room had moved. He nodded once and wrote something on his own clipboard. Dodd found Cullin afterward. He said only, "Well done, Sergeant." Then he walked away, which from Dodd was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Bradley's authorization came through in 36 hours, 100 modifications to be completed within 7 days. Welding teams were reassigned from engineering battalions. Steel was prioritized. Cullin was detached from his unit and assigned as technical advisor to the installation program, which meant he spent the next 2 weeks driving between depots training welding crews and correcting installations that deviated from the specifications he'd developed. The scale was staggering. By July 1st, 200 tanks carried his prongs. By July 10th, 400. Tank crews who had initially resisted the modification, calling it ungainly or untested, were requesting priority installation after watching Cullin-equipped tanks breach in seconds what had previously required 30 minutes of engineering support. Word moved faster than the paperwork. Units at the front began sending informal requests through channels bypassing the official queue. German after-action reports captured in the weeks that followed showed a consistent pattern. Enemy armor breaching hedgerows with unknown method. No belly exposure observed. Defensive positioning compromised. The Germans had built their entire bocage defensive strategy around the assumption that any tank crossing a hedgerow would expose itself for those 2 critical seconds. That assumption was no longer valid, and they had no immediate answer for why. German infantry commanders began repositioning their anti-tank resources, pulling Panzerfaust teams back from primary hedgerow positions and establishing secondary lines deeper in the fields. That repositioning created gaps. Allied infantry moved through those gaps. The defensive network that had held for 3 weeks began to fracture. The numbers told the story without sentiment. Before the Cullin cutter, the average Allied advance in bocage terrain was 400 yards per day, with an average of 3 tank losses per mile of front per day. In the 2 weeks following mass deployment, daily advance increased to 1,100 yards. Tank losses to hedgerow-related causes dropped by 63%. 3 weeks of stalemate. 2 days to build the solution. 72 hours to prove it to the right people. But success at scale always reveals problems that success in prototype concealed. By mid-July, field reports were coming back to Cullin with a consistent complaint. Tanks breaching multiple hedgerows in rapid succession were experiencing prong-clogging packed earth and torn root material jamming between the steel beams and reducing cutting effectiveness by the 3rd or 4th breach. Some crews were stopping to clear debris manually, which cost them the speed advantage the device was designed to provide. Cullin was working on a solution when a different report arrived. German engineers had captured an intact Cullin cutter from a disabled Sherman. They had taken it apart. They understood exactly how it worked, and Wehrmacht engineers at a depot outside Caen were reportedly working on a counter-modification for German armor. The tool that had changed the rules was now known to the enemy. And in Part 3 we discover what the Germans built in response, why it almost worked, and why the race to solve that problem led Cullin to the most dangerous decision of his entire career. The real war had just begun. A mechanic from New Jersey built 4 steel prongs from beach garbage. He proved it worked in 48 hours. He convinced a skeptical general in 72. And within 3 weeks, 400 Sherman tanks were tearing through hedgerows that had stopped the Allied advance cold. The daily advance tripled. Tank losses to hedgerow crossings dropped 63%. Then the Germans captured an intact Cullin cutter. They took it apart. They understood exactly how it worked, and Wehrmacht engineers began building a response. Here is the number that should stop you cold. In the first week after German engineers analyzed the captured cutter, 7 Allied tanks equipped with the device were destroyed in a single engagement outside Caen. Not by Panzerfausts at hedgerow crossings, by something new. The Germans had adapted, and now the weapon that had saved hundreds of lives had a target painted on it. This was no longer an experiment. This was a war within a war. The captured Sherman was brought to a Wehrmacht engineering depot outside Caen on July 3, 1944. The officer in charge of the analysis was Hauptmann Ernst Brecher, a mechanical engineer who had spent the pre-war years designing agricultural machinery in Bavaria. He understood immediately what he was looking at, and Brecher filed his report within 24 hours. The device is conceptually simple and mechanically sound, he wrote. Its effectiveness derives entirely from maintaining frontal armor orientation during hedgerow penetration. Our current defensive doctrine assumes belly exposure at crossing points. That assumption is now invalid. Recommend immediate tactical revision. The report reached Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, the following morning. Bayerlein read it twice. Then he called his staff together and said 4 words. "Tell me how to stop it." "Day." The answer they developed was not a counter device. It was a counter position. German anti-tank teams began abandoning their standard placement directly behind hedgerows. Instead, they repositioned at 45-degree angles to likely breach points 200 meters back. A tank bursting through a hedgerow would emerge facing forward, its thick frontal armor protecting it from direct fire. But at 45 degrees, the side armor was exposed. Side armor on a Sherman was 60 millimeters. A PaK-40 anti-tank gun at 200 meters could penetrate it cleanly. The new tactic required discipline and patience. German crews had to resist firing at the tank as it breached, wait until it was fully through and committed to a forward direction, then fire into the exposed flank. It was harder to execute than the original belly shot. But it worked. In the engagement outside Caen on July 8th, a single PAC-40 crew, using the new positioning doctrine, destroyed 4 Cullin-equipped Shermans in 11 minutes. Allied after-action reports from that engagement landed on Cullin's desk 2 days later. He read them 3 times. The device hadn't failed. The tactics surrounding it had been countered. The distinction mattered enormously, but the result was the same. Men were dying again. But this was not the only problem arriving on Cullin's desk that week. The mass installation program had revealed a flaw that small-scale testing had never exposed. When welding crews were rushed when they were working in the dark or under pressure, or without Cullin present to check their work, the prong mounting angles drifted. Sometimes by 2 degrees, sometimes by 5. 2 degrees of deviation from the specified 15-degree downward angle changed the force distribution enough that the prongs deflected upward on impact instead of digging in. The tank would strike the hedgerow. The prongs would ride up instead of penetrating, and the vehicle would begin to climb exactly as it had before the modification existed. 3 incidents of this nature were reported in a single week. In 2 of them, the climbing tank had its belly exposed and was destroyed. In the 3rd, the crew recognized what was happening, reversed immediately, and survived. But the reports created exactly the opening that Cullin's institutional opponents had been waiting for. Forsyth requested a formal review. The request was filed on July 11th and used precise, measured language that was more damaging than any open accusation. Given recent incidents suggesting installation inconsistency and emerging enemy countermeasures, a comprehensive technical review of the Cullin hedgerow cutter program appears warranted before further expansion. Cullin was called to give testimony. He sat across from a review board of 4 officers and explained the installation deviation problem with complete honesty, which was either brave or foolish, depending on who was listening. He described the angular tolerance required, the training gap that had allowed deviations to occur, and the corrective measures he'd already begun implementing. He presented a revised installation checklist, a go-no-go gauge he'd designed to verify prong angles before any tank was cleared for combat. The board deliberated for 6 hours. During those 6 hours, Cullin sat outside and thought about the 3 crews who'd been put at risk by installation errors his training hadn't prevented. The weight of that was different from the weight of the original design challenge. The design problem had been his to solve. The training failure felt like a different kind of responsibility. The board cleared the program. The corrective measures were approved. But the review had cost 8 days, during which no new installations were completed. 8 days during which the German angled positioning tactic continued to extract a cost. Then, on July 18, 1944, Operation Goodwood began, and everything changed. Goodwood was the largest British armored operation of the Normandy campaign. 3 armored divisions, nearly 1,200 tanks launched against the German defensive line southeast of Caen. The terrain was a combination of open ground and dense bocage. Allied planners had built the operation around 2 assumptions. First, that heavy bombing would suppress German anti-tank defenses sufficiently to allow armor to advance. Second, that Cullin-equipped tanks could breach bulkage obstacles rapidly enough to prevent the armored columns from being channeled into killing grounds. The bombing on the morning of July 18th was the heaviest yet seen in the campaign. 4,000 tons of bombs. The ground shook 20 miles away. German defenders who survived it later described it as the end of the world arriving from the sky. Then the armor moved. Cullin was attached to the 11th Armored Division as technical advisor. He rode in a command vehicle behind the lead tank element as the column pushed south from Caen toward the village of Cagny. The first hedgerows they encountered were the standard bocage variety, dense and ancient. The Cullin-equipped Shermans hit them at speed, one after another. Breach, advance. Breach, advance. The German defenders at the first line were still disoriented from the bombing. They tried to implement the angled positioning doctrine. It required coordination and communication. The bombing had destroyed both. They fired early from the wrong positions into frontal armor that stopped their rounds cleanly. The Shermans pushed through. Then the column hit the main defensive belt. Cagney was anchored by a cluster of 88mm guns, the most feared anti-tank weapon in the German arsenal. The 88 could penetrate any Allied armor at combat ranges. Normally approaching an 88 position through bocage meant exposing a tank at every hedgerow crossing, giving the gun crew multiple shots at a vulnerable target. The gun crew at Cagney had killed dozens of Allied tanks using exactly this method in previous weeks. Today was different. The lead Shermans breached the hedgerows at 15 miles per hour, not climbing, driving through, frontal armor forward. The 88 crews fired. The rounds struck frontal armor and failed to penetrate. The Shermans kept coming. The lead tank commander, Captain David Gale, later described what happened in his after-action statement. "We came through the third hedgerow, and the 88 was 40 meters away directly ahead. Their crew was traversing for another shot. We fired first. It was that simple. They couldn't understand why we hadn't stopped. The first 88 position was eliminated in 90 seconds. The second 400 meters further lasted 3 minutes. The third abandoned its gun and withdrew before the Shermans reached it. The column pushed 2 miles into German-held territory in 4 hours. 2 miles. In terrain where the previous weekly average had been 400 yards per day. German infantry defending the villages south of Caen began receiving orders to pull back. The hedgerow network they'd relied on as a defensive system was no longer functioning as designed. Tanks appeared from unexpected directions at unexpected speeds. The careful interlocking fields of fire that had made bocage defense so effective were being breached faster than they could be covered. By evening of July 18th, the 11th Armored Division had reached the Bourguebus Ridge objectives that previous planning had estimated would take 3 days to reach. German losses in the sector included 41 anti-tank guns, 16 tanks, and over 900 infantry casualties. Allied tank losses were significantly below pre-operation projections, with hedgerow-related losses representing less than 8% of total armored casualties, down from 61% in the pre-Cullin period. But the installation deviation problem was solved by the corrected gauge system. The angled positioning counter-tactic was addressed by infantry coordination, keeping riflemen close to breaching tanks to suppress the flanking gun crews before they could get off a clean shot. The two problems that had threatened the program in its second week had been answered not in a depot or a review board, but in combat by the men using the equipment. Cullin heard the final casualty numbers for Goodwood the following morning. He sat with them for a long time before saying anything. Word of Goodwood's success moved through every Allied armored unit in Normandy within 48 hours. Commanders who had been skeptical of the Cullin cutter, who had accepted it as a necessary inconvenience rather than a genuine capability, revised their assessments. Requests for installation priority flooded the depot system. Eisenhower's headquarters authorized 5,000 total units, a number that required sourcing steel beyond the available beach obstacles and commissioning purpose-manufactured cutting blades from supply depots in England. German strategic assessments from late July 1944, captured after the war, showed the impact clearly. Multiple documents referenced the bocage defensive system as compromised and noted that planned defensive lines in Normandy were no longer viable given Allied armored mobility. One intelligence summary used a phrase that required no translation. The hedgerow is no longer an obstacle. 4 weeks earlier, it had been the only thing stopping them. The Allied breakout from Normandy Operation Cobra launched on July 25th. Within a week, Allied forces had advanced 30 miles. The stalemate that had lasted 7 weeks collapsed in 7 days. Paris was liberated on August 25th. The timeline that experts had considered optimistic before D-Day was being met after all, delayed by 7 weeks, then compressed by an invention built from beach garbage in 48 hours. Cullin received the Legion of Merit on August 3, 1944. The citation described his contribution as materially significant to the Allied armored effort in Normandy. It did not use the word extraordinary, which Cullin later said he appreciated. He wasn't interested in extraordinary. He was interested in whether it worked. It worked. But here is the question that military historians have debated for 80 years, and the question that Part 4 will answer. What happened to Curtis Cullin after the war ended? What did a man who changed the course of the largest military campaign in history do when there were no more hedgerows to cut through? He went home to New Jersey. He fixed cars. He never talked about it. And the reason he gave when a historian finally found him 40 years later is the most important thing anyone said about the entire Normandy campaign. That story has one final chapter, and almost nobody knows it. A mechanic from New Jersey welded 4 steel prongs to a damaged tank in 48 hours. He convinced a skeptical captain, survived a hostile review board, proved his device in combat, and watched it get deployed across the entire Allied armored force. The daily advance in Normandy tripled. Tank losses to hedgerow crossings dropped 63%. Operation Cobra broke the stalemate in 7 days. Paris was liberated 6 weeks later. But the cliffhanger from Part 3 asked a different question. Not what the device did to the war. What the war did to the man who built it. Here is the twist that nobody sees coming. Curtis Cullin, the soldier. Eisenhower credited with one of the most significant tactical innovations of the entire European campaign, went home to New Jersey and told nobody. Not his neighbors, not his customers, not the reporters who occasionally called looking for a quote. He fixed cars. He raised his family. He lived quietly for 4 decades, while the invention that had changed Normandy sat in military museums behind glass with a small placard that most visitors walked past without reading. The reason he gave when a historian finally found him in 1984 is the most important thing anyone said about the entire story. And we will get there. But first, you need to understand what happened in the years between. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Cullin was in a small German town when the news came through, standing with Kowalski, holding a bottle of liberated German beer, watching soldiers celebrate with the particular exhaustion of men who have been waiting for something for so long that its arrival feels unreal. He received his Legion of Merit, his Bronze Star, and his promotion to warrant officer. He shook hands with officers who told him he'd changed the war. He said thank you and meant it, and felt nothing like what they seemed to expect him to feel. He came home to Cranford, New Jersey in late 1945. Margaret was waiting. His tools were where he'd left them. The garage needed work. He started the next morning. His neighbors knew he'd been in the war. They didn't know more than that because he didn't tell them more than that. When customers asked about his service, he said he'd been a mechanic, fixed tanks, nothing exciting. He did not mention Normandy. He did not mention the prongs. He did not mention Eisenhower or Bradley, or the 5,000 units, or the after-action reports that credited his device with shortening the campaign by weeks. He fixed their cars and sent them home, and that was enough. Captain Morrison, who had given Cullin his 48 hours, went on to a full colonel's rank and retired in 1958. He gave several interviews over the years in which he described the hedgerow cutter program, always crediting Cullin specifically and in detail. He once said that the decision to say yes to Cullin's proposal was the best command decision he made in the entire war, which was a generous thing for a colonel to say about a sergeant's idea. General Forsyth, who had called the program into a review board and used the word promising with such deliberate flatness, retired in 1951. His memoir, published in 1967, mentioned the hedgerow cutter program in a single paragraph and described it as a useful field modification that emerged from the innovative culture of the American soldier. He did not mention Cullin by name. Whether that was oversight or something else, the historical record does not say. Lieutenant Colonel Dodd, who had crouched beside a Sherman and listened to the resonance of the prong welds and then given Cullin his one formal chance, continued as an Army engineer until 1952 and then returned to Ford, where he spent 15 years consulting on commercial vehicle design. He and Cullin exchanged letters occasionally. The correspondence was practical in tone, two men who communicated best through technical problems and their solutions. Private Kowalski, who had helped weld the original prototype, and whose simple words had steadied Cullin more than once, was wounded in September 1944 during the advance into Belgium. He recovered, finished the war, and returned to Chicago, where he worked construction for 30 years. He and Cullin stayed in contact until Cullin's death, the kind of friendship that doesn't require frequent contact because its foundation was built under conditions that most friendships never approach. Cullin died in 1963. His obituary in the Cranford local newspaper described him as a veteran, a mechanic, and a quiet man who preferred fixing things to talking about them. It did not mention the hedgerow cutter. It did not mention Normandy. It did not mention Eisenhower's commendation, or the Legion of Merit, or the 5,000 tanks. His neighbors read it and nodded and remembered a man who had always been fair with his prices and honest about what a repair would cost. Yalvin. But his legacy did not die with him. It had already traveled far beyond anything a local obituary could contain. And the Cullin hedgerow cutter was formally retired from standard Army doctrine in 1947, when the post-war reorganization of armored forces reduced the emphasis on bocage warfare specifically. But the principle it embodied, using purpose-built forward attachment points to allow armor to breach obstacles without exposing vulnerable areas, became embedded in how American engineers thought about tank design from that point forward. The M48 Patton tank, which entered service in 1952 and served through the Korean War, was designed with forward hull attachment points that could accommodate various engineering tools and obstacle clearance equipment. The design philosophy explicitly referenced lessons from the Normandy bocage campaign. Cullin's name was not in the specification documents, but his geometry was. In Vietnam, American armored units operating in dense jungle terrain encountered a version of the same problem that Cullin had faced in Normandy. Vegetation could conceal ambush positions and restrict armor movement in ways that open terrain did not. The solution developed in the mid-1960s was the Rome plow, a large bulldozer blade mounted on armored tractors which cleared jungle vegetation at the rate of 1 acre per hour. The tactical principle: modify the vehicle to eliminate the terrain obstacle rather than navigate around it, came directly from the doctrinal shift that the bocage campaign had produced. Military historians who study the lineage explicitly cite Normandy as the origin point. Modern combat engineering vehicles, including the M1 Abrams variants equipped with mine-clearing rollers and dozer blades, operate on refinements of the same core concept. The tank does not navigate around the obstacle. The tank eliminates the obstacle while maintaining its armor orientation toward the threat. That idea, which Cullin sketched in a notebook in June 1944, is now standard across every major armored force in the world. NATO doctrine, Russian armor doctrine, Israeli Merkava design philosophy. All of them contain the echo of 4 steel prongs welded to a Sherman in 48 hours. The total accounting compiled by military historians working from Allied after-action reports and German prisoner testimony estimates that the Cullin hedgerow cutter was directly responsible for preventing between 8,000 and 12,000 Allied tank crew casualties during the Normandy campaign alone. That estimate accounts for the reduction in hedgerow-related tank losses between pre-deployment and post-deployment periods, adjusted for the increased operational tempo that meant more tanks were in contact with more hedgerows than before. 8,000 to 12,000 men who came home because a mechanic from New Jersey refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. But the largest lesson of the Cullin story is not about engineering. It is about the conditions that either allow or prevent good ideas from reaching the people who need them. Cullin succeeded not simply because his idea was correct. The bocage terrain had been studied by people with engineering credentials, military experience, and institutional resources. None of them had solved it. Cullin solved it because he approached it with a mechanic's mind rather than an engineer's training, seeing the system of forces rather than the catalog of previous attempts. But he also succeeded because Captain Morrison said yes when he could easily have said no. Because Lieutenant Colonel Dodd crouched beside a tank and listened rather than dismissing a sergeant's proposal on the basis of rank. Because the Army, under the pressure of a genuine crisis, created a narrow opening through which a non-credentialed solution could be tested. Remove any one of those conditions, and the hedgerow cutter never gets built. Or it gets built by Cullin privately and never tested. Or it gets tested once and filed under promising and forgotten while committees continue to meet. The idea alone was not sufficient. The idea required a system willing to hear it. And this is the pattern that repeats across military history whenever unconventional solutions emerge. Sergeant Alvin York, a Tennessee farmer and marksman with no tactical training, single-handedly captured 132 German soldiers in 1918 using skills that no military manual had described, because no military manual had been written by someone who grew up hunting in the Tennessee hills. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics who solved a problem that credentialed engineers had declared theoretically manageable but practically impossible. In each case, the solution came from outside the institution, precisely because the institution had already mapped the boundaries of what was possible and stopped looking beyond them. The lesson for every organization that depends on innovation is uncomfortable. The person with the answer to your most urgent problem may currently be changing your oil. They may be fixing your equipment rather than designing it. They may have no credentials that your screening processes would recognize. The question is whether your system has a Captain Morrison in it, someone willing to say you have 48 hours, knowing that if it fails, they will both be explaining themselves to very angry people. And now the final detail. The one that most people who know the Cullin story have never heard. In 1984, when historian David Carter tracked down Cullin in his retirement and asked him why he had never sought public recognition for what he had built, Cullin gave an answer that Carter included in his book almost verbatim because no paraphrase could improve it. And Cullin said, "I wasn't special. I was just a guy who knew how machines worked and saw a problem that needed solving. The special part was that the Army gave me a chance to try. How many other good ideas got dismissed because they came from the wrong person? I got lucky. My crazy idea got tested, but I guarantee you there were 100 other guys with equally good ideas that nobody listened to. My invention worked because people gave it a chance. That's the real lesson. Not that I was some genius, but that good ideas can come from anywhere if you're willing to listen." Carter asked a follow-up question. Did you ever regret not telling people? Did it bother you that your neighbors didn't know? Cullin thought for a moment and then said, "I made a tool that helped win a war. The tool did its job. What more does a mechanic need?" Here is what Carter discovered after the interview, buried in Army Corps of Engineers archival records and not published until 2001. The original prototype, the specific Sherman tank that Cullin and his crew modified in those first 48 hours, the one they called Rhinoceros, was not scrapped after the war. It was shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland in late 1944 as a reference specimen for the official documentation of the Cullin Cutter program. It sat in an outdoor storage lot for 17 years, exposed to weather, slowly rusting. In 1962, 1 year before Cullin died, an Army archivist named James Whitfield was cataloging the storage lot and recognized the tank from photographs in the program documentation. He flagged it for preservation. It was moved indoors. Cullin never knew. He died in 1963 without knowing that the specific tank he had knelt beside with a welding torch, the tank he had checked, weld by weld, the night before its first combat trial, was sitting in a climate-controlled warehouse 40 miles from where he had grown up. It is currently held in the collection of the National Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia. If you visit, you can stand in front of it. You can look at the 4 steel prongs, slightly corroded but structurally intact, still angled at 15 degrees. You can read the placard. Most visitors spend about 30 seconds with it before moving on. A mechanic from New Jersey built this in 48 hours from beach garbage. He proved it worked in a controlled test, then in combat, then before a review board that wanted to shut it down, then in the largest armored operation of the Normandy campaign. He saved between 8,000 and 12,000 lives by the most conservative estimate. He changed how tanks are designed. He shortened a war. He went home and fixed cars and told nobody. And when a historian finally asked him what it all meant, he said the special part was that somebody gave him a chance to try. If you have ever had an idea that someone called crazy, or if you have ever been the person deciding whether to give someone their 48 hours, then you already understand why this story is worth telling. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, the forgotten ones, the ones where the person who changed everything was the last one anyone expected. Because history is full of Curtis Cullins. Most of them never got their chance. The ones who did changed everything. Poem.